Good morning. Thank you guys for attending. We got a great turnout for navigating the new normal and beyond. We're gonna have a panel discussion, which is the first one we've ever really done on a webinar format. So thanks for joining us. I'm just gonna go over a couple quick things that I really wanted to spend most of the time on Q&A and discussion. So we're gonna just slam right through this. As the agenda goes, just a quick little intro. I'm going to review the agenda and some housekeeping items, and then we're going to get right into discussion with Susie Weir from Xenium HR on HR and remote working and those sort of things. Then we're going to dive right into a discussion with Luke Reese on the legal aspects of this new normal that we're going through right now. And Luke is from Garrett Heeman Robertson. And then Andrea Potter will be here at 10:30. We'll talk about tax and all the PPP things and answer a lot of your questions around then. One thing I wanted to mention is that in the chat window, there are links to their bio. So if you want to just go through and check out their background and where they work and all those things, you can do that as well. Okay, and then we're going to have 15 minutes of Q&A at the very end. So make sure to get your questions in. And as we're going through each of the discussions with Susie, Luke, and Andrea, you're welcome to ask questions. We're probably going to hold most of those to the very end to make sure we have enough time, though. Okay. A couple quick housekeeping items. This will be an hour long, 15 minutes of Q&A at the very end. And we'll have minimal slides on this, just a couple quick visuals. So on Zoom, if you want to go to the top right, I believe it is, and change the gallery settings to have video be the primary and then the slides secondary, you're welcome to toggle that back and forth. A lot of people have some technical questions as it relates to that. And then use the Q&A for any questions that you have. The recording will be available, so if you have to pop off or you missed part of this, you probably later today, you'll get the recording from us as well. And then lastly, go to xeniumhr.com and you can subscribe to all of our updates and you'll get alerts about events like these in the future. So we're gonna have Susie up first. Susie, I'm gonna unmute you here. Welcome.
Welcome to you.
Good to see your face.
Yeah, you too.
This new normal is, it's out of control, right? It's been a month. Most of us been working remotely for, and it's normal for us now. I mean, we're 4 or 5 weeks in, and I think a lot of employees have questions around all this, the future. It's uncertain, right? So, one question I wanted to start off with: how do I respond to an employee if they're uncertain about the future? If you get a lot of these questions about what happened in the next month or two, like from an HR perspective, how are you answering that question?
Yeah, this is really difficult because we don't necessarily have answers. I have noticed a tendency to hold off on communicating until leaders have decisions or answers. And I think this is a little risky. What I have discovered, in spite of my best efforts, is that in absence of frequent communication, people unfortunately assume the worst case scenario. So, even when I've thought I've done a really good job of touching base with employees and making sure they feel informed, they are still spinning and worrying. And so I think we need to really be sensitive to the fact that people are really anxious, and we need to be asking questions to understand where they're at. So in this time of change and uncertainty, it's best to communicate frequently, even if there are no updates to share. So you may say, here's what we know today. And I would say do this weekly as a business, communicate with all your employees weekly. So we can't necessarily make statements like, we don't plan to do any layoffs, right? Because you can't necessarily guarantee that. But it is helpful to be transparent about the business. So for example, you may communicate that your company has applied for the PPP loan. And the intent is to retain employees. So the loan is forgivable. You want to take advantage of that. You may also communicate that if cost-cutting measures become necessary, company leadership will be evaluating multiple options in an effort to minimize the need for layoffs. And there are multiple ways employers are looking at managing expenses, such as scheduling, salary reductions, or negotiating temporary holds on vendor agreements. I recommend, again, that employees hear some update from leadership about the business weekly. Things are changing so fast and people are feeling anxious about their jobs in the future. It's also, oh, go ahead.
Is there a particular method of communication that you prefer for the weekly updates? Does it need to be an email? Could it be video in some way? Like, what have you seen that's worked?
Yeah, I think that having an opportunity for employees to ask questions is important. So either a call or a video meeting is probably optimal. Or if you're communicating via email, allow people to submit questions to you, or even do the question submission before your meeting. So, the nonverbal is so important too. That's how we understand each other. So I think video is probably the first option, and then phone, and then email after that. But some clear communication about, okay, here's where we're at today. Nothing's changed, so here's what to expect. Or if there's new information to share, and then make sure people have avenues, comfortable avenues to ask questions. I think it's also worth considering your return to work strategy. So if you have people who are teleworking or on furlough, I think it's worth thinking about, okay, how might that look? And maybe do some planning around that. I think we're gonna have to be flexible with employees, just as we were at the onset of the stay-at-home order. There'll be employees with health and safety concerns, so thinking about how you're gonna be communicating around that. I have a really strong feeling that we're going to have a lot of folks with some mental health related requests, so a lot of anxiety as we shift back again to being on site or in the workplace. And I think that will likely require some ADA interactive process discussions, and I'm sure Luke can talk more about that when he speaks.
One of the things that's come up a lot is with this new normal of people working from home, and they're not necessarily used to some of the technology that we're using. For example, we're using Zoom right now with video, and I imagine a lot of people are using those types of technologies. So how do you support staff that doesn't have the highest of technical skills when it comes to some of these tools?
Well, I think we've all had a crash course in some of these platforms. I know I have, and we've had to react pretty quickly. So, training hasn't been readily available. So with this abrupt transition to remote work for many people, we had to start communicating and getting work done through technology. So I would say, as much as employers are able, and I know a lot of employers have already been doing this, provide employees with the tools to use at home. So making sure they have the right equipment and technology, whether that's, allowing them to bring equipment home from their office, or working with them individually to see if you can arrange something for them. They need to have a functioning workspace if they're teleworking. Zoom and Teams are probably the most used platforms. And what I found on their sites is they have video tutorials and live trainings that are really easy and accessible on those sites. So I would remind people and have them play around and check out those. Also, check in with employees regarding their comfort level and maybe offer some one-on-one instruction. As with anything new, practice builds confidence and capability. So maybe look for low-risk opportunities to test out or practice the new technology. So it could be practicing a meeting, or even using the tools for fun team building opportunities where employees can connect. We have a couple of employees who are more tech savvy in our organization, and their workload has shifted or dropped a little bit. And so we've leveraged them to put together some training aids and send those out to employees, and also provide some one-on-one instruction. So I think those are some ideas. The last thing I think I would say is that establishing guidelines and norms for how and when technology is used is helpful. So for example, when should I be using email to communicate versus chat? Or when do we use video? And the more you can establish those norms around how you're leveraging these tools to communicate, the more efficient you'll be.
Nowadays, managing remote is pretty challenging, I'd imagine. So measuring performance and coaching and those sort of things, what sort of metrics should we be looking at from a managerial standpoint to make sure that we're documenting that people are getting the work done, and that they're they're doing the things that you need to do as a manager, and managing remote is a lot more challenging. So what things have you done to make sure that you could do that effectively?
Yeah, I think this gets really hard in certain jobs where there aren't hard and fast metrics, right? There's no productivity numbers associated with someone's performance. So maybe their performance is based on measures like observation and feedback. So, even when there are no hard and fast metrics per se, data points, you can still set objectives and measure results. So it comes down to creating action items and setting agreements. So for example, if someone is working on a project, so maybe right now they're able to do a specific project that's, in addition to their regular work. So it may be breaking down that project into tasks and having a conversation with the employee about, okay, how are you going to accomplish these tasks, including timelines for completion. And then this will allow you to follow up regarding progress and completion. So really just setting that plan and those agreements around, okay, what does the desired result look like? And then how are you going to break that down into action items and then timelines? The more challenging work to supervise is client service. So, a lot of employees are still connecting with clients and providing direct client service. And, as supervisors, we might not have visibility to what that looks like. So I think as much as you can, lead with trust and trust that the employee is delivering timely and quality service. To stay informed about this, I would use weekly touch-base meetings to discuss how the employee is managing their workload, what support they may need to do their job well. If they're demonstrating competence and commitment, I would trust them, lead with that. If you have concerns about their performance, I would ask some open-ended coaching questions to uncover barriers that might be present. Is it they're not feeling motivated or confident, or is it that they're not feeling capable, or they don't have the right tools to feel effective? We need to ask questions to understand what those barriers are before we can start exploring some options. And then I think having those agreements, again, if they're not following through with those agreements, it's okay to review and audit their work. I think now is a good time too, if you're a professional or client service, customer service type business, it's good anyways to proactively reach out and touch base with your clients just to connect, right, from a relationship standpoint, but also understand how you can best support them right now. And then that might be an opportunity to obtain some feedback about the service that they've received from your employees.
Yeah, I think the one thing that probably comes up in employers and managers' minds right now is, am I getting my money's worth out of my employees, not knowing exactly what they're doing? So I think a lot of the tips you provided, they're pretty helpful. Any other things you want to cover before we transition over to Luke?
I think that's it. And I'll just be open to questions if there are any later on.
Okay, yeah. Ask questions of Susie. We're monitoring Q&A here, and we'll save it for the end. And by the way, as I transition, is my microphone scratchy? A couple people have mentioned it. I want to make sure that I change the settings and that it's sounding better. Luke, do you hear me? Okay.
I think it's sounding better now. It was scratchy there for a bit, but whatever you have done to fix it is working.
Who knows with this technology? I think I'm good with technology, and sometimes then it's who knows, the interwebs will mess it all up. Okay, so Luke, it's good to have you back. You did a webinar with us a few weeks ago, and we didn't even get to everything. There's a lot of changes. There's a lot of questions came in that we couldn't answer. So it's really nice to have you back. I want to start with this question here. So what if an employee refuses to come into work even though the employer has taken the CDC recommended measures for PPE and social distancing?
It's a good question, and it's one that a lot of my clients are wrestling with now. The reality is there's a lot of motivation for folks not to be at work beyond just legitimate health and safety concerns. With the increased unemployment benefits, there is some real financial incentive to stay at home, or I think more accurately stated, less financial incentive to come to work and work for the money. There's two ways to look at this. The first one is when you've had to reduce your workforce because of a reduction in need, and now you're looking to ramp back up and you're trying to decide who to bring. The best advice I can give there is start with volunteers, and you'll limit having to deal with this issue really to the maximum extent possible. So identify what type of employee you're going to need as you start to ramp back up, solicit who would like to come, and then the hope is that you'll reduce the amount of people who just flat out refuse. Once you exhaust that option, or if you're at a point where you are at max capacity and you have employees who are showing some resistance to work, the best advice I can give is, as long as you are comfortable that you are providing a safe work environment for your employees, you can require people to come to work. As the business owner or the employer, it really is a decision that's yours to make. Now, you can't force an employee to work. If they ultimately decline, that's their choice. But if you're providing a safe environment, you're following the CDC recommendations, and you're confident that you're in line with the governor's order about what companies can be operating and what can't, you can tell an employee that if they'd rather not be there, then they're effectively resigning. It's a tough conversation to have. I will tell you that most of the time when I get calls on this topic, the supervisor, the employer, hasn't actually talked to the employee in any real detail. And when I encourage them to go back and get the specifics about why the employee's hesitant, what you find is most people don't want to just sit at home and get unemployment. They have legitimate concerns. And if you talk through those concerns, most people will come back to work, and they come back to work confident that everybody's got their safety at kind of the forefront.
Do you think as we start heading back to work, which who knows when that necessarily will be, do you imagine that a lot of people will be a little nervous coming back into the office, and even practicing social distancing from the CDC recommendations? Do you feel like, I mean, this is just speculatory, of course, but what do you anticipate happening?
I expect there's going to be a tremendous amount of anxiety, stress. I think Susie hit it right on the head. We are going to have to be dealing with not just concerns, but legitimate health reasons why people may not be able to come back to work, just like things were in January. I'm sitting in my living room right now, and I haven't been out of my neighborhood in a month. I can't wait to not have to work with my kids running around the house, but in the same breath, I'm really nervous about what that looks like. Treat it just like any other accommodation issue. The interactive process that we're all used to using to deal with employees who have health concerns and may need accommodations is the exact same process that we're going to want to go through as we navigate the return to the new normal. So having the conversation, soliciting input from your employees, not only on what their concerns are, but what they would like to see to address those concerns, I think is going to be a real practical way to deal with these issues. But also from a liability standpoint, if you're ever ultimately sued based on the decision that you make, if you can show that you went through that interactive process and you can document what that looked like, I can tell you it's going to be really easy to dismiss of those lawsuits. If you are just telling employees, this is the way it's going to be because I say so, and you're not having those interactive meetings, you're going to be much more at risk for, I don't know what the lawsuits are going to look like, but I'm sure they're going to be flying as soon as we get through all this.
How do the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, so it's also known as the FFCRA, how do the leaves work with other types of leaves? Like, for example, employees who might be currently on disability or work comp leaves?
Yeah, we talked about this in the last webinar we did, which, it's only 2 weeks ago, but it seems almost months ago because so much has changed and we've got so much more information. The short answer is the emergency leaves that we have in place here really are different than any other leaves. So it's a new benefit that is available to employees. It doesn't really replace or modify any other leaves that are out there. So if you have an employee who happens to be finishing up a workers' compensation leave, they were out on family leave to welcome a new baby or to deal with another health issue, you would welcome them back just as if this whole situation wasn't going on. Where it may impact the situation is if you have somebody who's set to come back, but for a reason that's now protected under the FFCRA, you'd have to take a look at whether or not they'd qualify for additional leave under that. The only other thing to keep in mind is the expanded family leave for folks who have to be at home because their kids' daycare or schools are closed. That is not in addition to other types of FMLA leave. So if somebody exhausts their FMLA leave staying at home with their kids now, it may impact their ability to have additional leave later on in the year.
Real quick before I ask you another question, we're getting a lot of questions coming in, and we have a full webinar. There's 100 people in here as of right now, which is our max. And as questions come in, if you wouldn't mind stating who the question's for, that will just help us kind of sift through at the very end and direct it to the right person. So Luke, this next question really handles the legal aspect of what I asked Susie earlier, which is like, how do I make sure people are working? So for companies who have salaried employees that are working from home, but they're only doing a few hours of work a day because they have to be somewhere or handle their kids, or they just can't really do the full scope of their job. Or maybe they're out with customers on a regular basis, but now they can't. How are we handling that situation?
So I liked everything that Susie said and certainly agree with it. Once you've looked at, is there other work that salaried employees can be doing with the limitations of everything that's going on? And you've confirmed there just isn't. For whatever reason, their position does not line up with what we're dealing with in this whole scenario. Then you do have a few options. We can reduce salaries during this time. The only limitations there is if you go below $684 a week, they no longer qualify as an exempt employee, and you need to make sure that you're adjusting them to non-exempt status and treating them just like any other hourly worker. I will tell you, I've been a little surprised recently. I've got a lot of clients who are doing that. And when you change an exempt employee to a non-exempt employee, it has a really significant psychological impact. That is something that I would encourage you to avoid if at all possible, because people respond to that as, oh my goodness, like this is a really big deal. Whereas if you can keep them at their salary level, I think you avoid some of that additional anxiety and stress. The other thing to keep in mind is you have to do it at the beginning of the week. This is a mistake that several people have made just because they've been moving really quick. But keep in mind that if you're an exempt employee and you work any time in a given week, you need to be paid your salary for that week. So if we're going to be reducing salaries, even if it's temporary, make sure that you keep it above $684 a week, and make sure that you do it on that Sunday night transition into Monday, so you're not accidentally taking money that an employee would create a claim by one of your employees. The other things that we're seeing is furloughs. You can furlough in conjunction with a reduction in salary, basically say in recognition that we're going to pay you less, we expect more or less out of you. You can also furlough by the week. I've seen certain companies who are letting their exempt employees work 1 week and then take the next week off unpaid. The kind of last softer way to go about it is recognizing that we may be slow now, but as soon as some of these limitations are lifted, the exempt employees are going to be exceptionally busy, is to encourage your exempt employees to use this as true PTO time. That's kind of a ridiculous request to make when you're telling people to vacation under these circumstances, but saying, hey, stay home with your family. We're going to pay you during this time and expect very little out of you. But be ready, because once the governor lifts her order, it's going to be all hands on deck, and we're going to need you working a lot then.
Yeah, so then that brings us to the big question, and hopefully you can outline this for us. So what should I be considering, me as an employer, for planning purposes for now and really prior to bringing people back from furloughs and layoffs and in bringing them back to the office environment?
So there's two things that I think everybody needs to be looking at as we get out our crystal balls and start looking into the future about bringing people back. The first one is the safety aspect, and that really should be the focus. How am I going to do this safely? And getting as much information as you can from the CDC and others about what that looks like is step one. Step two is having a written plan for how you're going to roll people back. Of course, that plan is subject to change, but contemplating who's going to come back first and prioritizing that. Are you going to have split schedules so you have less people in the office? Are you going to allow certain people to continue to work from home? All those decisions really should be ironed out as much as humanly possible before you start implementing them. Once you focus on the safety, then the next stage is to protect yourself against claims. And there are going to be a lot of claims brought by people who are disappointed with the way that they were reintroduced into work. We need to worry about the safety, but also people who are going to be upset because they were brought back at a different time than some of their coworkers. At its core, this issue focuses on making sure that you have a legitimate business reason for the decisions about who comes back when and at what compensation levels. You have a lot of leeway, and that's the nice thing, but you do need to have a plan that articulates, here's why we are treating people differently. So anywhere that you're going to have, especially similarly situated employees who may perceive that they're being treated different than their coworkers, we need to have an explanation as to why that's the case before we do anything. It should be in writing. To the extent you can share it with your employees, I would encourage you to do that. Transparency is going to be very helpful here. I know that's an uncomfortable feeling because it is such a fluid situation, but as long as you are clear in those communications, this is the plan right now, it's subject to change, just like Susie talked about. I think you're going to go a long way to preventing lawsuits. And if there are those filed, you'll be in a position to defend your company.
Thanks a lot, Luke. Stay on tap here because I think you're going to be busy during the Q&A session. There's lots of questions coming in for you. So
Great.
thanks for the time. Andrea, I'll turn over to you. I'll unmute you. We're going to talk about some tax related things, which is great because in our last webinar, we really talked about the legal and HR aspect, but never the tax portion of this. So I know there's going to be a lot of questions, and we're going to start with a few for you. So what record keeping and reporting is required to obtain the tax credits for the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, the FFCRA, Emergency Paid Sick Leave?
Perfect. Yeah. So basically, with any of these credits, you're going to want to, do as much detail tracking as possible. So, in regards to the paid sick leave or family emergency medical leave, you're going to want to make sure you get, the written request from your employee for their reason, why they're gone, the dates they're gone. Is it a school? Is it another family member? Is it them? What the reason is, because that's how that credit is calculated. And then you're going to want to, based on IRS requirements, you're going to want to document how you came up with those wages. And then in addition, you're allowed to include qualified health plan expenses. So you're going to want to be able to prove that documentation of how you came up with that number. On top of any forms, 941s, additional forms 7200 for the advanced credit payment. Basically with these credits, the more detail you have, the better it will be.
Any thoughts on how to keep things nice and clean from a reporting standpoint?
I think you just have to figure out what works best for your business. Is there an electronic way to do it? Can everyone put it into an electronic file somewhere secure? Do you need to do a paper file? Just find a good process that everyone in the company understands. So that way, if multiple people are involved, they're able to follow that same process. So you'll be able to locate that documentation.
How does the Social Security tax deferral work?
So basically the Social Security tax deferral is the employer portion of the Social Security tax. So it started March 27th and will run through the end of the year. Right now, we're waiting on the new 941 form. The IRS has decided that first quarter 941, the form is not going to be amended or updated. So anything from March 27th to the end of March is going to need to be reported on second quarter 2020. We have yet to see that form. So once that's provided, it should give us a pretty good idea of how to file that. And basically, so then the two payments, you'll pay 50% of the deferred employer Social Security tax, December 31st of 2021, and then December 31st of 2022. So you're gonna wanna track this again, just like the credit. You're gonna wanna make sure you track it because other credits, the employer retention or the FFCRA credits may come out of this amount. So your deferral by the end may adjust. Another aspect that's important to note is if you've received a small business PPP loan, once your loan is approved and forgiven, you can no longer defer. So you can defer up until the date that your PPP is forgiven. And once it's forgiven, you need to make payments timely after that.
Is the Social Security tax deferral automatic, or how does that work? Do you work with the payroll provider to do that?
Yeah, so basically the IRS has stated that employers don't need to make a special election. They can just choose to do it if they prefer.
Okay. And then how do employers claim the employee retention credits?
So basically that refundable credit is going to be 50% of the qualified wages that the eligible employer pays to employees up to $5,000. So like I said, if when we were talking about the PPP loan on the deferral, if you have a PPP loan, you cannot take the employee retention credit. Basically, all of these credits, the FFCRA, employee retention, or the PPP loan, you basically don't want to double dip. So if you're doing one item, you can't do the other, is pretty much how it works. So basically what you're going to do is, and like I said, we're still waiting on the quarterly 941 form, unfortunately, which I'm going to have to keep saying that during this because that's like the #1 thing we're waiting on. Once we have that, we'll know more information on how to report that in the instructions, reducing your wages and the related healthcare costs to be able to keep the money. So basically, it'll go against the employer share of Social Security tax. And if you don't have enough money in that tax that's due, you are allowed to take it against federal income tax withholding, the employee's share of Social Security and Medicare.
What's the difference between the Paycheck Protection Program and disaster loans? And, you know, what, as an employer, what should I consider if I want to make sure that the loan is forgivable?
Okay, so basically, they're two separate programs, and what you're going to want to do when you're debating them is the benefits depend on your business and your situation. So the PPP loan is primarily payroll. So if that's your focus, you'll want to work on that loan, and because that loan is 100% forgivable, up to 100% forgivable if you follow all the requirements. The EIDL loan is a loan that can be used for other aspects that aren't necessarily payroll and may not be covered under PPP. You can actually have both loans, but like I said prior, you can't double dip. So you can't use an EIDL loan and a PPP loan on the same wages or the same items. You can have both loans, but they need to be used for different aspects of your business.
How should employers be tracking Paycheck Protection Program expenditures?
So basically, like we talked about in FFCRA, you're going to want to stay as organized as possible. You're going to want to make sure that a lot of people have created a separate bank account so you can track where the money is coming from. You're going to want to retain all documentation from your loan, your payroll costs, any overhead costs, to be able to make sure that you can prove that you've used it for the right items. You're also going to make sure that the money that you've received is used in that 8 weeks, and that 75% or more is used directly for payroll costs.
And how are full-time employee headcounts determined for the PPP loan forgiveness? Is it full-time like the ACA, or is it calculated differently?
Well, right now we're still waiting on guidance from the SBA for how they're going to calculate that for the loan forgiveness. The wording in the bill and in the rules says full-time equivalent employees. So we assume that that's going to consist of full-time employees as well as the calculation for full-time equivalent employees. But because we have not seen any additional guidance on that, unfortunately, we're still waiting on it. Hopefully, March 27th is when the rule came out, and they have 30 days. So we're hoping we would get that guidance pretty soon.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. You shed light on a lot of questions that probably needed to be answered. Anything else you want to cover before we dive into Q&A? There's lots of questions for you, so we can dive into those right away. Or if you want to cover anything else, since we have a few extra minutes.
No, we can probably just
all right.
jump in and start
Okay,
tackling.
I'm going to unmute everybody. Let's do this. Let's start tackling some of these questions here. And I'm going to just encourage you to use the Q&A module on Zoom versus the chat window to ask questions, and then make sure to specify who you want the question asked for. Okay, where do we want to start? Let's see here. I think this might be for Luke. So if an exempt employee misses full days when work is available, please confirm if we can require PTO use, or is it an unpaid day?
For exempt employees, for the most part, we need to be doing it by the week. So if an exempt employee just takes a day off for a certain reason, unless it's one that would allow us to treat it as a PTO day previously, they would be paid. So if it's just because there's not work for them to do on that particular day, we need to take them in week chunks.
Thank you. Okay, this one's for Andrea. Can we include repayment of wage cuts and or retention bonuses in our 8-week calculation of wages for purposes of PPP loan forgiveness?
Well, unfortunately, like I said, we're still waiting on that loan forgiveness guidance. So hopefully once we get that, we'll be able to have more clarification on how we stay at the level of salaries and level of full-time equivalent.
Okay, this one I believe is for Luke. Under the FFCRA, if you have an employee who is needing to stay home with an 18-year-old senior who has an IEP for a communication disorder to aid and support the child through distance learning, would this be covered under the FFCRA reason number 5?
Probably. So this is the question, basically, if my employee didn't need to stay home with their kids prior to this, are they now protected? And it's kind of a weird lens to review the issue through. What I'm encouraging folks is, if an employee makes the request that they need to be home because of their school-age children whose schools are closed, don't necessarily worry too much about how they handled their situation previously, just because so many things have changed with the schools, and instead ask for the documentation to support the reason why. And if they can provide it, yes, give it to them. Now, if there's something that's really suspicious, like you have an employee who has older teenagers who they never stay home to take care of, and it truly appears like they're trying to take advantage of this, we can scrutinize it a bit, but I would reserve that very much for the exception.
And Luke, going back to an earlier question that you helped answer. The person who asked it just wanted to clarify. So work is available for the person, but they just chose to take the day off. So would that be, could you use I think the question was forced PTO or unpaid?
Yeah, you can do it as PTO. If they, for whatever reason, reject that, I would be careful about doing it as unpaid unless we got to the bottom of the reason for the rejection. But if somebody says, hey, I'm overwhelmed, I know there's work to do, but today I need to take a day off to take care of other things, it would be just like any other PTO request.
Okay, next question. Can I require an exempt office employee working from home to return and work in the factory? We have plenty of social distancing practices in place.
Yes, most likely. It's a new job offer essentially, but if it's one you'd like to make, you can go right ahead. The risk there that I'd be worried about is some sort of discrimination claim. So be able to explain why you picked one employee out over others, but as long as you can do that, you're fine. The scenario that I'm worried about and that I think is going to get people in trouble is when you have an employee who's just not your favorite or is somebody who you really struggle with. If it looks like you're picking on them in this scenario, you could get yourself in trouble just as if you fired them. So it's not a time to play games, but if there's a legitimate business reason to do it, go right ahead.
Thank you. Okay, I think this one would be for Susie. It's a long one, so I'm going to try to paraphrase it if I can. So on the topic of weekly updates from leadership about company viability, where while communication to internal employees is hugely important, no doubt, small business owners only have so much time in a day to prioritize amongst like focusing on protecting financial liability, analyzing endless pages of government loan programs. Basically, they're busy as heck. And how do you spend time crafting communication? That way it's flowing from the top and people can rally behind it.
Yeah, I get that. There's a lot going on, and it's, while business may have slowed down in some ways, we're busier than we were before, just trying to keep up with everything. I would suggest doing what's natural for you. So if you're someone who is a better communicator through writing, then take some time to jot down your notes. Or if it's easier for you just to have more of an informal conversation, or just have a Q&A, quick Q&A stand-up meeting via video, I think that's fine too. Another thing that you can do is if you have someone in your organization, or even an outsourced partner like Xenium, someone who is good at crafting employee communication, that they could craft at least a draft for you to review and provide your edits. So that might be something that would help you if you can delegate at least coming up with a draft, and then all you have to do is review it and then deliver it. That might be an option too. But I think it doesn't have to be anything super lengthy or formal. I think people just want to hear from the senior leaders and the people running the business. They want to see your face, be able to ask questions, and just have a quick, connection about, hey, here's where we're at today,
Yeah, just to add something to that. So we've been doing these weekly wow card readings, which is basically an employee recognition program. And in our president at Xenium, Ann Donovan, I think she might be on the webinar with us. She will get on and just kind of do a little quick State of the Union in addition to emails. And I love that because people, for one, can see her face. We'll communicate any new developments and things like that. And I know people appreciate that. Okay, this one is for Luke. If we hired on new employees during this time, how would benefits play out? Would they qualify for unemployment benefits or work share during this time as well?
The clock will start ticking for both of those. Unemployment right now, the formula has kind of been thrown out of whack. So the short answer is if you hire somebody and then they are laid off, they're going to be eligible for unemployment at some level. It's just going to be minimized by the amount of time that they're with us. Really, what you need to be looking at is the adjusted timeframes for some of these leave benefits that are in place right now. We need to keep in mind that you only need to work for someone for 30 days to qualify for the Emergency Coronavirus Relief Act leave, as opposed to having worked for several months like FEMLA. So that's the biggest impact. But yeah, if you hire somebody now, they very quickly are going to be entitled to benefits if you have to unhire them shortly after that.
Okay, this one's for Andrea. If we have applied for the PPP loan but missed the first round of funds, can we utilize the tax credits until we know if we will get the loan?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like at this point, they're stating that, if you know that you're not, if you currently don't have a PPP program and you're taking like the employee retention credit, until we get more guidance because you don't have the loan, you probably can take advantage of it. As we like to say, always talk to your CPA, always double check because things change on a daily basis. But usually most things that we've noticed that have been released as guidance says, as long as the point in time when you know that you're doing this, that you don't have it, you're doing it as good as you can, and with a clear knowledge that at that time you did not have that loan.
These are great questions. Keep them coming. We've still got lots more. This question is, I'm going to assume for Luke, if an hourly employee is forced to take a reduction in pay while being required to maintain 40 hours, are they able to reach out to the unemployment office to make up for the extra money they have lost due to the pay cut?
Probably not, although I wouldn't discourage your employees from investigating it. There's a distinction between we're going to pay you less an hour but allow you to work full time versus we're going to continue to pay you the same hourly rate, but there's going to be a reduction in your hours. When it's a reduction in hours, the benefits are going to be there for the most part. When it's a reduction in pay but you continue to work full time, that's going to be something that's going to be at the disadvantage of your employees.
Okay. Sift through some of these. Okay. Question is, I understand EFML among FFCRA provide 12 weeks of leave. Is this 12 weeks of leave in additional to the OFLA leave, for example? So total will end up being 24-week leave for this year?
All right, let me make sure I say this right. For the most part, no, it's 12 weeks total, and this is just another reason that you can use those 12 weeks. The rule basically is if when you took the leave, if it was available under state or federal leave at the time, then you don't get to double dip. I'm trying to think, there's a potential scenario. Well, no, let's leave it at that. It shouldn't get much more complicated than that, but of course, leave questions, you can go down a million rabbit holes, but the intent isn't to give everybody an additional 12 weeks to be at home with their kids. It's 12 weeks total in the year period. This is just another reason that you would qualify.
Okay, Andrea, I think there's a piece of clarification that somebody's asking. So the question is, you can't use the FFCRA benefit and a PPP loan?
You cannot use the wages of the FFCRA in the PPP wages. So basically, any between the PPP loan, the FFCRA, each one is a separate piece. So you can't double dip. So if you're reporting the wages as a credit for the FFCRA paid leave, those wages are not included, and that healthcare is not included in the wages for the PPP loan.
Thanks for the clarification.
Yeah.
Can I say something or ask
Yeah,
about that? So up to the point that you receive your PPP money, is it fair to say that you can claim the credit for the we've got all these analogies. The FFCRA, so that's the 2/3, for example, that someone's utilizing under the emergency paid sick leave. So up to the point I get my PPP money, I can claim the credit for those wages for the emergency paid sick leave. But once I get my money, my PPP money, then from there on, I may not be able to claim those wages for the emergency paid sick leave.
Well, it depends if you need it. Yeah. So basically, if you're claiming, if you need those wages under your PPP loan to meet payroll, you know, to meet all your requirements, then more than likely you wouldn't ask for it under the qualified, you know, under the FFCRA. You just can't, you can't use the wages in both locations. So you just have to decide how you're going to report it. If you're going to claim the paid leave under FFCRA, then you can't use those wages under PPP. So if you don't have the PPP loan, that's really your only option is if you have qualified paid leave under FFCRA. You just have to make sure with every one of these that if you're going to put it into one box and report it under that, those numbers cannot be used under something else.
Okay, thank you.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, Luke, this one is for you and it's really specific. And I'm going to ask you this question because I think we're going to see a lot of this as probably people return back to work. So this person wants to know, is this acceptable? We had an employee get to a point of depression and high anxiety and panic over being called back to work. They were so scared to leave their home or come back to work. This person was so overwhelmed that I suggested they call a COVID-19 hotline. She called me back the next day and was a lot better and was able to tell me that she did not want to return yet. I told her it was okay to be cautious. She still had a job and could still consider herself on furlough.
Great job, I think is the answer. This is a new area, so I'm going to give the ultimate advice of do what you're most comfortable with, because ultimately, if you need to support that decision, if you can do it with kind of your head held high and explaining why, we'll be able to make it work. With that said, the key is to treat this just like any other disability request and engage in that interactive process, which is what I heard Brandon describe here. You got the information from your employee, you asked for the kind of basis behind it. I'm assuming they gave the employer's perspective of why they're being invited back. They came up with a solution that works for everybody. I wouldn't expect that that person's going to file a lawsuit. So going through that interactive process, I think is going to get ahead of a lot of these issues. But if you have somebody who says, I have depression or anxiety or whatever it might be, and it's preventing me from coming to work, then we would go through the next step of the interactive disability process, which is going to be to get information from a health provider, which of course has all kinds of other issues associated with it right now. And then try to come up if there's an accommodation that can be made to allow the person to do the job. I think what we're going to see a lot is people whose accommodation request is to continue to work remotely for a period of time that's beyond what we would prefer to do in a perfect world. And previous to this whole scenario, I would have said, hey, that's an easy one. We don't have remote work available. If the person can't do it in person, then we can't accommodate their request. We can end their employment. That advice has to change now, because we're going to have a month or several months of showing that telecommuting is possible. So that's where we're going to have to take a fresh look at this and say, can I accommodate this employee's request by allowing them to keep working remotely, or essentially continue social distancing beyond when the government says it's mandatory? And that's going to depend on the circumstances, whether or not the employee was truly successful or if we just were limping by. But going through that interactive process the way that this person, it sounds like they did, is perfect.
Right. We probably got time for 2 to 3 more questions. So keep them coming if you'd like. Andrea, this one's for you. My question is around tax benefits side of things. If we apply and receive a PPP loan, can we also benefit from the Social Security tax credit benefit through our payroll?
The deferral, I guess, is the question there. So let me see, I'm trying to think. Can you repeat it again just to make sure
Yeah, so if we apply and receive a PPP loan, can we also benefit from the Social Security tax credit benefit through our payroll?
guess I'm trying to figure out what the Social Security tax credit is. I mean, like we said, I was just trying to figure out what that means. I mean, if the employer retention credit is against that employer Social Security, amount, and that can't be taken if you have a PPP loan. So, I think it's just important to look at every piece that you're doing and make sure that that you meet all the requirements for everything that you're doing. So if you're doing a PPP loan, you don't want to do employer retention.
I wonder if they're asking for about the Social Security deferral.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's the case, my understanding is if you're using your PPP loan money to pay for the payroll, those payroll dollars would not, you wouldn't be able to also defer.
Correct. Yeah.
Claim or credit some type of tax credit on those wages that are paid with the PPP money.
Correct. Yeah. Sorry. So yeah, I mean, basically you don't want to double dip. So if the government's giving you money to pay a PPP loan, then you're going to want to use that to pay those taxes.
Okay. Let's see here. Luke, what about high-risk groups? Can we require them to return to essential businesses?
If an employee has a doctor's recommendation that because they're high risk, they not come back, then you can't force them to. I don't know when that's going to change, but it's definitely the case right now. At some point it's going to, but we're not there yet.
Okay. Okay, so if an employee says they're having depression from staying home and wants to come into the office to work during the stay-at-home order, do we have to allow them to do that? We have other essential employees in our office already, but don't want to get our office too crowded.
No, if you've got a reason to exclude the person and their only reason to need to get to work is I need to get out of the house because people are driving me nuts, you can say, we're sorry, we hear you, but no. I think where it may become an issue is if somebody's fearful for the amount of money they can make because they're limited in working from home, they can generate more commissions, they'll hit matrices to get a bonus, and you're telling them, no, you can do it, you just need to be able to explain why. And I would explain why to the employee before they have a concern to get ahead of that.
Another one for you, Luke. We're using Oregon WorkShare. Is the 600 additional unemployment stipend available pro rata for WorkShare participants?
I don't know is the answer. I'm sorry, I don't know that one. I think the WorkShare website is pretty good, and that's where I would go to answer it, but I'm afraid I don't know that one off the top of my head.
Okay. We have not received a PPE loan, but have retained our team. Would we then qualify for the employee retention credits?
So it would depend on, yeah, as long as you are an eligible employer and you meet those requirements that the IRS has put out there, that are basically that you're a fully or partially suspended operation during a calendar quarter in 2020, and if you've experienced a significant decline in gross receipts during a calendar quarter. So it's important to just go out and see if you qualify as an eligible employer for that credit.
Okay, well that, we're going to wrap up now. I put contact information for each one of our panelists on the screen here, and tons of free resources from Xenium. Luke, Andrea, anything you want to point people to as well? Content that you guys have coming out or anything like that?
No, I enjoyed the opportunity to catch up with everyone. I think the thing to keep in mind is this is moving so quickly that advice is going to change, if not in nuance, maybe in pretty significant ways. So the key is to make sure that you're keeping your eyes and ears open about those changes. Certainly, if you need to reach out to any of us to get the latest, that's what we're here for. But it's a moving world, and we need to keep that in mind.
Yeah, and I'd like to add that I try to keep updated articles on the Geffen Mesher blog when things come out, and hopefully once we get more information on the loan forgiveness requirements, we'll be able to get that information out as soon as possible, since hopefully that will show up in the next few weeks.
Okay. Thanks, guys. Susie, anything from you before we leave?
No, no real parting words of wisdom, other than hang in there, everybody. I think the next step is considering how we're transitioning back. So, you know, staying connected with employees and as much as you can, and then also start thinking about what that return to work could look like, and putting together some ideas and thoughts around that, so you can be prepared to communicate that proactively.
I suspect by the next time we do this, and I hope we get to do it again, we'll have some guidance from governors on the West Coast about what the return to work is going to look like. So I assume that'll be a topic of interest the next time we get together.
Yeah, it sounds like people want us to do this again. This is well attended, and folks are wanting weekly updates. So I don't know if we could do it that frequent, but I would definitely love to have this group back. Thanks for attending, guys.
Thanks.